Hello, I'm Jenny Mann at Physical Electronics, and today I'm going to be describing some work that we've done, the XPS depth profiling of metal-halide perovskites. So, metal-halide perovskites have the crystal structure that I've shown to the right, ABX3, where A is usually methylammonium, formamidinium, or cesium, and B is a metal, usually tin or lead, and X is a halide, usually bromine or iodine. So metal halide perovskites have many possible uses, such as light-emitting diodes, lasers, transistors, but they're perhaps most well known in solar cells. So looking at the NREL best research cell efficiencies chart, we see perovskites right here, and they're relatively new. This chart starts at 1976 compared to some other solar cells. But in the last about 15 years, they have seen increases from about 4% to 25% efficiency. And there are some even newer solar cells shown that I've circled here, which are a silicon solar cell with a perovskite on top. And those we've seen efficiencies upwards of 29.1%. So perovskite solar cells are also relatively low cost to fabricate, and they have the potential to do large area fabrication. They do have some stability limitations with respect to moisture, high heat, or extended periods of light. So, as well as methylammonium lead iodine has environmental concerns since it does contain lead. However, there's a lot of ongoing research to solve these stability problems, as well as substitute lead for something a little less environmentally hazardous like tin. So what kind of properties might be important for a perovskite? For example, the composition. In a film, what do we see what we expect? Is there any residual processing contaminants left over? For chemistry, do you observe chemical bonding consistent with what the perovskite structure should be? Are there any differences in the bulk versus interfaces? And uniformity, like is a film continuous on the surface, or are there gradients from the substrate to the surface, or any evidence of diffusion between the layers? So XPS and XPS depth profiling can help to provide some insight into these properties. So we have been doing a collaboration with Russell Holmes' group, Professor Russell Holmes at the University of Minnesota, and his graduate student who recently graduated in August, Dr. Catherine Clark. So what we've started with is we have a few different perovskite thin films that we've looked at. The first is a simple single layer, so it's either methylammonium lead iodide or methylammonium tin bromide, and then a slightly more complicated heterojunction structure where the B site, the metal site, has been varied. So we would have a tin perovskite on the top, followed by a lead perovskite. Then Catherine took it to 11 and made it even more complicated. So varying both the A site with either a methylammonium or formamidine, as well as the B site, tin and lead. So the results of her studies, both with XPS and other analysis methods that she used, are found in this recent publication of ACS Energy Letters. For the XPS part of the study, of just the general perovskite study that we did, what we first wanted to do was to kind of establish a baseline using the simple system. So what is the quantification at the surface? Is it possible to clean the surface? When we depth profile through the film, is the composition maintained? Which sputtering gun should we use? So we did all of these XPS experiments on the VersaProbe 3, shown here in our demonstration lab in Minnesota. So we a couple of the conditions that we used. So our X-ray beam is a 100 micron diameter monochromated aluminum K-alpha beam. And we used both the C60 and argon gas cluster sources, both of which are on our lab system. So starting with just surface analysis of a methylammonium lead iodine. Okay, so what we did is we wanted to minimize the possibility of surface contamination. So we stored the sample in an argon glove box until we were ready to analyze it, then did the transfer from the glove box via a transfer vessel into the instrument. And then just as a check of uniformity, we measured 5 areas of the sample. So I've shown the results of that here in this atomic concentration table. So if you look at our areas 1 through 5, we detect carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iodine, and lead. And generally, we see about the same amount of each on each spot that we analyzed, indicating that the film was fairly uniform of the areas that we checked. However, if you compare these concentrations to the expected composition of this perovskite, you see that there's a lot more carbon than expected. So if we look at the narrow scans, we see, indeed, we have at least 2 chemical states of carbon. One of which is the contamination of adventitious carbon, and this is very common contamination, so it's not really surprising that we observe it. And then the second peak here is from the methylammonium, and possibly also, because we do see some oxygen, perhaps some carbon-oxygen bonding as well. So in order to try to get a little closer to what the expected composition is, what we can do is we can curve fit this spectra, and I just did a very simple two curves, and then get the atomic concentration once we remove essentially the contribution from the adventitious carbon. So we do get closer to the expected value with about 28% compared to the 40%. And then the other elements end up closer to the expected value. Lead is actually quite good, but clearly just curve fitting the spectra was not enough, probably just because there's also some other contaminations that are very difficult to remove if they have a similar binding energy to carbon nitrogen. So we wanted to try cleaning the surface with our ion guns. So what we did is we took a few different ion gun settings. First, we tried the C60. We did 60 seconds of sputtering, and then we looked to see what the composition was after that. And we see carbon and nitrogen have gone down considerably. Iodine is a little higher, and lead is much higher. We also tried 2 different argon gas cluster sizes, 620 cluster size as well as 1800. And these 2 sputtering at 1 minute also did not result in the expected composition. But it looked like maybe we were on the right track with the low EV per atom. So we tried to sputter for only 15 seconds, and that's what I've shown in this red box here, and we actually have very good agreement with the expected composition. However, what I would say from this data is that it seems that it's quite tricky to remove just the contamination and not affect the composition of the perovskite. Even though we seem to be on the right track with this low EV per atom, we do ultimately want to sputter through these films. So what we did is we again tried some different ion gun conditions. So that is what I've shown here. So in this one, we're looking at the methylammonium tin bromide perovskite. So it's well known that a monatomic argon does considerable damage to organic components. So we just focused on the cluster guns. So I have 2 different argon cluster sizes that I looked at, the argon 620 and a large cluster, argon 2500, as well as the C60. So if I look kind of overall at all of these profiles, what I see is the carbon nitrogen, which are the black and dark green traces. The ratio stays about 1:1 on every single profile, which is the expected composition. However, tin, which should be in the same, a 1:1 ratio with the carbon and nitrogen, is much higher than expected. And that's true for every single one of the depth of the ion gun settings. Bromine is around 50%. So then if we look a little closer at the argon gas cluster, we see that the organic component comes up and it goes down, but then when we see the inorganic component, that kind of tails well past when we see a lot of the substrate, indicating that we're not effectively removing the tin and bromine with the argon gas cluster gun. So that's different from the C60, which I will show a little larger view of. Since this is our ion gun of choice, we see that the organic component does drop off faster than the inorganic component, but the inorganic component does not do the same like long tailing that it did with the argon gas cluster gun. And this is not necessarily a big surprise. The C60 tends to have a little more similar etch rates between different materials, so it's always a good gun choice for any kind of hybrid organic-inorganic material that you might have. So we're going to continue and do the remaining depth profiles with the C60. So now we've kind of established our base system, so we're going to look at some heterojunction perovskites. So perovskite heterojunctions can offer new opportunities in device engineering. There are potential issues of mixing of the layers. Could we identify which of these species are diffusing? And in Russell Holmes' research group at the University of Minnesota, Catherine used a combination of solution-based deposition, which I've shown here, followed by vapor deposition in order to make heterojunctions. And she found some that had stabilities of greater than 1,500 hours, which is about 2 months, which I think is considered very stable because in the paper they mentioned that it's generally considered that if a heterojunction formation is successful, that means that there was enough time to measure both the X-ray diffraction pattern and the absorbance before it started mixing, which is about 30 minutes to 2 hours after the film was deposited. So 1,500 hours compared to that is a big number. What they do is they deposit their film, and then they measure X-ray diffraction and absorbance at incremental hours afterwards to see when the heterojunction starts to mix or if it stays separated. So for the XPS contribution to this work, what we did is we looked at 3 perovskite heterojunctions. So the first was the slightly more simple one where you only vary the B site. So we only varied the tin and the lead. And then the sample that we had was one that should not be mixed, and that was the one that showed good stability over greater than 1,500 hours. The second 2, both the A and B sites were varied with methylammonium or formamidinium, and then the lead and tin metal center. So Catherine brought us 2 of those. One was unmixed, so essentially we were analyzing it less than 100 hours after she made the film. And then the next one was mixed, so we analyzed that one more than 1,500 hours after that film was deposited. So what we're going to look at is what does the XPS depth profile show? Are the layers indeed unmixed, and the layer that is mixed, we also see that it's mixed, Can we tell which site is the one that's mixed? So the first one, just to simplify things for the remainder of these plots, I do not show, although I did include them in the atomic concentration, I don't show the contributions from the substrate, just to keep this plot looking a little cleaner. So the first one, where the B site was varied, we indeed see the rise of the tin, and then it goes down, the lead comes up, the methyl ammonium is about 1-to-1, and then this one, so we think this one is not mixed, which is what she had already determined based on X-ray diffraction patterns. You see that what she shows is the separated components, the methyl ammonium lead bromide and tin bromide, and then this is the heterojunction. And so since there's no peak movement or additional peaks that have shown up, that indicates that no perovskite alloys have formed, so that the two layers have remained separated. So in the next group of samples, as I already said, we looked at both an unmixed and mixed, and this is where both the A and B sites were changed. So with the previous one, it was quite easy with XPS to separate them. Tin and lead do not overlap, so they're different elements, so it was quite easy to separate the two components. With changing out the organic component for another organic component, that's a little more complicated. So methyl ammonium is shown here, has 1 carbon, 1 nitrogen, and formamidinium is shown here. So the question is, will we be able to differentiate these two molecules with XPS? And I believe, yes, we will be able to. So methyl ammonium, the carbon-nitrogen ratio is 1-to-1, and in the formamidinium, it's 1-to-2. So we should be able to see that. In addition to not just the atomic ratios, we also have 2 different chemical state environments for both the carbon and the nitrogen. Carbon single bond versus carbon triple bond, or carbon bonded with 3 bonds to nitrogen. And these should produce different binding energies in both the carbon and nitrogen spectra. So this first one is unmixed. So what I've done is I have shown, again, a simplified version without the substrate included. And then I have indicated with arrows a few key points along the depth profile that I've then selected some spectra for the carbon and the nitrogen. So what we see is the tin layer comes up, and that's correlated with the methyl ammonium, which is what it's supposed to be. Then we see those go down. We see about a 1-to-1 carbon-nitrogen ratio with the methyl ammonium layer. And then the carbon nitrogen layers belonging to the formamidinium we see here, indicated by the gray and the light green traces, and the ratio is about 1-to-2 here, and that is correlated with an increase in the lead concentration, and then these drop off as we go into the substrate. And if we just look over at the spectra real quick, we see that pretty much right at the surface, if we look at the carbon, there's maybe a little adventitious carbon right here, and then we see the peak belonging to methyl ammonium, and we don't see anything that correlates to the formamidinium. And that's true of the nitrogen as well, only 1 chemical state of nitrogen. If we go to the point at about 14 minutes, which is about right here, so that's kind of at the interface between the two films, we indeed see that we can see 2 separate states for the carbon and 2 separate states for the nitrogen. So XPS is a good method to look at these components because they're separated, but we both can see that the composition, the ratio between the carbon to nitrogen changes when we go from one to another, as well as the binding energy of the carbon and the nitrogen. And she, again, took the X-ray diffraction pattern to confirm that this sample was unmixed. So the final sample that I'm going to show is the mixed sample. So in this one, what we see, again, I've selected just a few points along the spectra, along the depth profile to show the carbon and nitrogen spectra of. So we see the tin concentration go up, down, followed by an increase in the lead concentration that then drops off as we go into the substrate. So it looks like for this one, the lead and the tin, so the two metal B sites, have not really mixed. However, what we do see is we see both methylammonium and formamidinium in the tin layer, and that extending out through the lead layer. So if we then go and we look at the spectra, we see that after 1 minute, so just after a surface cleaning, we already see contributions from both methylammonium and formamidinium in both the carbon and nitrogen spectra. So based on these results, this would indicate that what has happened is that the B sites stayed separate, but the A sites have begun diffusing. So in summary, we used XPS to investigate a number of different perovskite thin films, both single films and 2 different heterojunctions. We did minimal sample cleaning with the argon gas cluster gun in order to remove the surface contamination, and with just a little bit, we were able to see the expected composition. We chose the C60 ion gun for doing depth profiling. The layer structure was clearly observed for both the inorganic and organic components. The composition was closest to the expected composition using the C60, which is why we chose to continue using that gun. And we did observe a sharper interface for the inorganic component with the C60 than we did with the argon gas cluster gun. In the heterojunction perovskites, we are able to distinguish the 2 different perovskite layers, and in the case of the mixed sample, we observed that the A site was responsible for the mixing rather than the B sites. I'd like to thank Professor Russell Holmes at the University of Minnesota, as well as Dr. Catherine Clark, who often would drive the samples from the university out to the suburbs where our lab is in order for us to analyze them as quickly as possible. And she graduated in, I think, August, and is now is a Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow at the Materials Research Society. And if you're interested in learning more about what we have done, we have this publication, and I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.